Today we continue the discussion of the name statistics argument for the historicity or historical reliability of the Gospels and Acts, and a recent critique of that argument by Camille Gregor and Brian Blais. So today I'm going to be talking about one of, I would say, the three biggest problems with their statistical analysis. There are other problems that I see, but there are two or three that are really huge, and I would say this one lays claim to be perhaps the most important, and I call it mutilating the sample. Now, a note about terminology as we go into this. I will try to be consistent with this terminology. I may have some slips of the tongue, so please forgive me if I do. A name, in my terminology and Gregor and Blais' terminology and Richard Bauckham's terminology in this argument, can be used for more than one person, right? Obviously. So the name Simon is one thing, and the person, Simon Peter, is another thing. I will try consistently to say 79 persons when I mean persons, okay, and maybe 454 names when I mean names, and to maintain that distinction consistently. As I say, I may have a verbal slip, but that's how those are used. Okay, so if we speak of a number of persons, we mean something different than if we speak of a number of different names, okay? Because multiple people can have the same name. Another terminological thing is the term occurrences. Now, one reason why I'm not going to use that very often is because it's just not a natural language use of the word occurrences, but it is useful. And this is because one person can have more than one name. Last time I briefly mentioned disambiguations. So, Simon, Peter, right? Simon is one name, Peter is another name, but they're both used for the same person, Peter being used to disambiguate between that Simon and a different Simon. So when Gregor and Blais talk about occurrences, and this is fine, what they mean is like a pairing of a person with a name. Okay, so in Simon Peter, you've got the pairing of a person with the name Simon and a pairing of that same person with the name Peter. And so in a sense, you have two different occurrences, each one of one occurrence of one name apiece. So you've got one occurrence of Simon there and one occurrence of Peter. Sometimes I'm going to use persons and occurrences interchangeably, but there is this technical difference, because you can have one person with two names, and therefore that person constitutes an occurrence of one of those names and then an occurrence of the other name. So that gets a little bit confusing, but I think you'll see that in practice as we go along, it's not as confusing as you might have thought. So that's terminology out of the way there. This crucial procedure that Gregor and Blais engaged in, that I call mutilating the sample, the Gospels and Acts sample, was this. For any person, if his existence is attested in the Gospels or Acts and is also attested in the writings of Josephus, the unargued Pauline epistles, or Papias, and there might be a fourth one, but I think those are the three places, they take that person and that person name occurrence out of the Gospels and Acts data set. Because what we're doing is, as I discussed last time, we're comparing the Gospels and Acts name data with the name data in Tal Ilon for Palestinian males, because that's where, she's got a big bulk of names to give us a really interesting statistical population. So they're taking these people out of the Gospels set solely because they're attested to exist elsewhere. Now, this is just really, really strange, and it's very important because there are about 26 of these persons. So they start out with 79, which is Bauckham's number. I think it should be just a little higher. I would argue for 83, but I'm not going to argue for that here in this video. We'll use 79. They start with 79 persons, which is Bauckham's number, and then they reduce that by 26 because there are 26 persons who are attested in these other places. So, for example, Ananias the high priest or Annas the high priest, these two are attested in Josephus. James, the brother of Jesus, is attested as existing in the Pauline epistles. Jesus himself attested as existing in the Pauline epistles. And even Thomas, they take out, several disciples they take out because Papias mentions them. So just because they're attested elsewhere, and what they say is, well, we're not contesting the existence of these persons, so we're gonna take them out of the Gospels and Acts data. Now that is really strange, and that's their only argument. I was just reviewing this a few minutes before I started recording this video. Like, can that really be their only argument? But that is the only argument that they give, is that these are, quote, not in contention of being invented. Let me read a quote here. Here they're talking about the analysis of the Gospels and Acts name statistics. They say it is largely uninformative because Gospels Acts already include a large number of persons independently attested to exist, and therefore not in contention of being invented in the process of anonymous community transmission in the first place, which leaves the sample size of contested persons and their names very small. Okay, so yeah, 79 minus 26 is 53. 53 is quite small. They even call this a crucial consideration. The phrase anonymous community transmission is Bauckham's phrase to describe form criticism, which he's arguing against. And so they're saying that, hey, if we just grant that these people exist, then we're not even going to leave them in the Gospels and Acts sample. This is extremely hard to understand. Like, why? And the only thing I can think of, but it still doesn't really amount to an argument, is that they seem to be thinking that if they grant that these persons existed, then nothing about their use in the Gospels and Acts can possibly be relevant to the argument. Because ultimately we're curious about whether the authors of Gospels and Acts were inventing things, and so they're not arguing that the Gospels and Acts invented these persons because they grant that they exist, so they just have no place in the argument. We're just going to take them out. Naturally, this makes a big difference, and actually I decided, because this video is already going to have some length to it, I'm going to talk somewhat more in the next presentation, which I believe will be released on Christmas Eve, about what difference this makes that you could just see right away just by reading their argument, even without doing an elaborate statistical reanalysis. And they obviously think it's going to make a difference. That's why they call it a crucial consideration. They acknowledge its importance. So they don't seem to realize several things about why these names should be left in the Gospels and Acts sample. For one thing, the stories about them are in many, many cases unique to the Gospels, or Acts, even if the persons are attested elsewhere. So, for example, the story of the involvement of Annas the high priest in Jesus' trial. Okay, that's not found anywhere other than in the Gospels specifically. Okay, so if we're wondering about anonymous community transmission and invention, then a skeptic is certainly open to the possibility, even if he doesn't have to deny that Annas existed in order to be thinking that perhaps the author, John in particular, who talks about Annas being involved in Jesus' trial, invented the idea that Annas was involved in Jesus' trial, right? That could be, or maybe not John, maybe just some anonymous community member, right? So those stories could certainly be the product of anonymous community transmission. So there's still something at stake here. There's still something on the table at issue between people who think the Gospels and Acts are highly reliable and those who don't. Also, the Gospels and Acts are implying that they have their own access. I mean, no, that kind of meta-level statement is not explicitly made, but when John tells the story about Jesus being brought before Caiaphas and also being brought before Annas, he's implying that he knows, this story himself. He's certainly not, admitting that he's making it up. Okay, so these are supposed to have some kind of importance for the Gospels and Acts historicity, because either those stories are true or they're not. Remember what I said last time, part of why this argument is so attractive is because of the sort of organic way in which these names arise. Okay, Ananias' name, the priest Ananias, arises because he presides over the trial of Paul. So it's not just somebody sort of listing a name and then going, oh, and by the way, he existed, and I'm not going to say anything more about him. His existence just arises in this very natural way in the telling of the story. So it's embedded in the story, even though we have lists of the disciples of Jesus. Still, when it talks about, the 12, right? The 12 were with him and so forth, and that goes back to that list, who are the 12, and many of them, of course, have more specific stories about them, a speaking part, as we might say, Philip or someone like that. So they're not just listing the fact that somebody existed in some bare fashion, and therefore we're still disagreeing about something, okay? Another thing that they don't seem to realize that shows that they definitely should have left this in there, this is very important statistically. Those of us who are making the name statistics argument are arguing from what you might call the shape, okay, of the distribution in the Gospels and Acts. The shape of the names. We've got this many Simons and this many Josephs and so forth, and then it kind of dribbles down, to only one or two of each of these and so forth. This is why I used the phrase mutilating the sample. If you grab nearly a third, okay, almost exactly a third, 26 of 79, and you rip them out of your sample is very likely to have a different shape, okay? You're going to be tearing them out, and then the statistics aren't going to be weighted the same. They're not going to look the same. So we're arguing from that whole shape of that sample as it relates to the number of people with different names, not, okay, hey, it mentions this guy, so this guy existed. It's rather from, adding up how many of each of these we find and then looking at the whole thing. So if you go grabbing, several people of these different names and just pulling it out, it's just not going to look the same anymore. Related to this, the fact that some other writer attests to the existence of a person that's also mentioned in the Gospels and Acts doesn't change the fact that that person is mentioned in the Gospels and Acts, right? And if we're asking, what is the appearance of the statistical occurrences of names of people about whom stories are told or who are described or who are mentioned in the Gospels and Acts, these persons are relevant to that question. we want to know what that looks like. They don't cease to be relevant to that question because somebody else over here it says that that person existed. I mean, why would that change the relevance to the question of what the sample looks like in the Gospels and Acts? So it just makes no sense at all. A reductio of this would be, suppose we had even more persons mentioned in, say, the Pauline epistles, then we would become less and less able to evaluate the appearance of the statistics in the Gospels and Acts. So, for example, suppose that Paul mentioned that Jesus' foster father was named Joseph, and that he had a brother named Joseph. Like he mentions that he had a brother named James. Oh, that's two Josephs fewer. Gotta take them out now because they're independently attested in the uncontested Pauline epistles. Why? Like, why would we take those out? They even have a rather strange bit of rhetoric at a certain point. They say, they're talking about Papias, and they say, we grant to Bauckham that the disciples whom Papias names correspond to the disciples in the Gospels. But actually, they're going to use that against Bauckham because they're going to use that as an argument for taking them out of the Gospels and Acts sample. And then as they say, it's largely uninformative, because they already include a large number of persons independently attested, a crucial consideration and so forth. So don't try to tell us you're granting something helpful. Usually when we say I'm granting this to my opponent, it's supposed to be something that's helpful to your opponent. But in this context, for them to quote unquote grant that these are the same disciples named in the Gospels and Acts is their excuse for taking them out of consideration. So please don't tell me about what you're granting to Bauckham about the disciples named in Papias. It's very strange. They're counting against the Gospels, something that overall you would think would count for the Gospels, right? That they're named elsewhere. And moreover, it seems that it should count for them both in terms of external confirmation. In many cases, I wouldn't necessarily say Papias, but Josephus, naming them, but also be able to count by way of just its contribution to the statistical shape of the Gospels and Acts distribution. All right, now, if we knew that they were not independent, if we had some very strong extra evidence from somewhere else that if any person is named in another source, one of the Pauline epistles, for example, or in Josephus or whatever, that the occurrence in the Gospels or Acts is just based on that, say somebody found out that this guy existed from Josephus and then he just made up a story about him. If we already knew that, then that would be one reason why we could argue for taking them out of consideration. Like, well, we know that this isn't something the Gospels are reporting on their own or from their own sources of information. We already know they just made this up based on Josephus or even based on the Pauline epistles. But to their credit, Gregor and Blais don't make that an argument for taking these names out of the sample. They do suggest at one point that Luke may be basing, or the author of Acts may be basing his work on Josephus, but that's just a possible hypothesis that they're talking about. It's definitely not the argument that they give for taking the names out of the sample. I think they realize, to their credit, that would be question begging, that you can't make that a fundamental assumption of your entire statistical critique. We're just assuming that if it's attested over here, then they just grabbed the name from there and made up a story about him. They can't just assume that to start with. So I don't think that's why. And also, I don't think I would be surprised if they would argue that Papias writings occurred before the writing of Mark. Okay, but there are disciples, named in Papias that they're taking out of the Gospels Acts sample, even though those disciples are named in Mark, which, they consider to be the earliest gospel. So I don't think they're at all implying that, Mark based those disciples' names on Papias. So I don't think that's their argument. As I say, it's just baldly, they almost seem to consider it obvious that if these are not in contention of being invented, if they just grant the existence of these persons, then we've just got to take them out of consideration altogether and remove them, and then turn around and complain that now we only have a sample size of 53 because we subtracted 26 from 79. That's terrible methodology. It's not correct. There's no argument for it. I want to make two analogies to close this out. One of these analogies was suggested by my husband, Tim McGrew, and then I made up one of my own. So I hope this will help. This one is from Tim. Suppose there's a basketball player and you are trying to evaluate how good he is at free throws. And a certain number of his free throws have been captured on video and are included in a highlights reel of his career thus far. Now, 100% of those are successes, right? The reason they're included in a highlights reel is because, whoa, he made it. He got that free throw. He made that free throw successfully. And then there are others that are not on the highlights reel. They just, come from other sources. This is what happened. He made this free throw attempt and he did get it or he didn't get it or whatever, but they're not on the highlights reel. Suppose that someone said, okay, all the free throws that are on the highlights reel, we will grant occurred as they occur there successfully. He made them. Those are not in contention of being invented. We're going to grant that those are real, successful free throws. Now, we've got this entire set, which includes those, among others, of free throws and their outcomes that are reported in these other ways. Well, we're going to remove from that set all the ones that are on the highlights reel because they're not in contention of being invented. And then we're going to evaluate how good of a player he looks to be just based on the ones that are left. And, suppose you had 79 to begin with and you had 26 that were on the highlights reel, 100% successful, because that's why they included them on the highlights reel. And you take those out and then you look at what's left and it's kind of a mixed bag. And you say, he doesn't really look like he does all that well. He's not all that impressive of a player. When we consider the contested free throws, the ones that are in contention as possibly being invented, it's somewhat better than nothing, but it's really not all that important. It would look a lot different if you had left in the ones from the highlights reel. So taking them out of consideration as evaluating his ability, because they're on a highlights reel, is not a good procedure. You should consider, the larger series, including the ones that were put on the highlights reel. So that's one analogy. Now here's my analogy. Suppose you have a coin and you've measured it in a lot of different independent ways. Sorry about that motorcycle going by outside. You've weighed the coin. You've tested its thickness. You've looked at it to make sure it's not warped in any way. You've done all kinds of tests, and you're convinced the coin is fair. So it should turn up, in the long run, 50% heads, 50% tails. Okay, now there's this group of flips that is done. 79 flips, okay? and a video camera is turned on and off, okay? And what we want to decide is whether the human reporter on the ground is a good reporter, okay? Based on whether his reports of the flips and their outcome seems to fit with the independently known fact that the coin is fair. So we're testing him. We're testing the reporter at this point, okay? So we have the 79 flips, and he writes down which are tails and which are heads, and then we've got this video camera that was on for 26 of those, okay? And he didn't know that, which ones were on and where it was off. Okay, so we say, well, you know, we're not going to contest that the 26 that are videotaped turned out in such and such a way, which is, in fact, the way that he said. So we're going to take those out of the set. And now we only have 53 reported by him. And now we're going to look, and golly, you know, like, the heads are now outweighing the tails by quite a bit. But besides, it's a pretty small sample. It's only 53. And so this is kind of uninformative about how reliable he is as a reporter, because it's only a sample of 53. Of course, you had a sample of 79, but you mutilated that sample by taking out the ones that were recorded on the videotape. There's no reason to do that. Okay, if we want to look at his report of heads and tails and say, how does this correspond to the fact that we know the coin is fair, then we should just look at all 79, because we can do that, right? We can look at the 79 and we can kind of say, you know, all right, that's not a very big sample anyway, by the way. 79 is not all that big of a sample, so it becomes a really big deal to mutilate it by about a third by taking 26 out. But at least we can get somewhat better of an idea of how his reports correspond to the fairness of the coin. But it's going to be harder to get an idea if we take out the ones that were recorded independently, nor is there any reason to do so. Okay, again, if we knew that he had gone and watched the video and then, I'm going to, erase what I said and I'm going to write down what the video says, but we can't assume that to begin with. We're trying to decide by looking at the shape of his set of reports whether he's a truth teller or not about the way that the coin falls. So obviously it would be question begging to assume that he, cheated. So it would be a very, very bad statistical procedure to take out 26 of those outcomes just because they happen to also be caught on camera. So I hope that gives you an idea of why this is not a good approach for them to take those out. Next time, I'm going to be talking about some of the specific impacts of that. Until a full reanalysis is done, I can't be super confident, definitely it made this difference, but we can point just by reading their article to places where it's plausible that it would make a difference, and I think they would acknowledge that it would make somewhat of a difference because they call it a crucial consideration, and they actually say that this is a reason why the analysis is largely uninformative, is because supposedly we're supposed to take out 26 of these names right at the beginning from the Gospels and Acts reports. Okay, so come back next time. And I hope you're having a joyful Advent season. And I hope you will have a Merry Christmas, in case I forget to mention that next time around. And please come back as we continue this series on the Gospel's name statistics argument at the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.